Good morning, folks, and welcome. This session that we've put together in a continuing education program at Queen's is focused on some history on Newfoundland Regiment, Newfoundland's role in World War I. We decided to put the program together particularly because of the 100th anniversary of Beaumont Hamel, but appreciating and properly remembering Beaumont Hamel requires some understanding of the whole context of Newfoundland at the time, Newfoundland history, and military involvement. So we have a good program set up over the next couple of days, and we look forward to people being able to learn from it, both by attending the sessions in the room, here at Queen's, online, and using the recorded sessions. Welcome to you all. I'm going to pass it on now to Mr. Tony McAllister, who is, I described him as a professional historian. He says he's not a professional historian, but he has done a lot of research, has compiled his research into a book and shared a lot of his research and knowledge with others, and is a very active member of the broader community, and a go-to person to get facts right, even stuff that's published at times and otherwise broadcast, and of course a great contributor to the community, and particularly a great resource this year as Newfoundlanders and Canadians and people elsewhere are more aware of the events at Beaumont Hamel, and I suppose in a respectful way, more respectful of the contribution that Newfoundland and servicemen all over contribute to developing the world as it is for us, particularly in Canada where we have such freedom. Tony, thanks for agreeing to present, and I'll hand it on to you.
Thank you, Rick. I'm going to jump right into this. We have a fair bit of material to go through. It's condensed, to say the least. I'm hoping I can get through what I need to in 45, 50 minutes. Anyway, it seems we have a problem already. Okay, here we go. It's a little slow. Okay, here we go. August 4th, 1914. War broke out in Europe. The call to arms went out to all of Britain's colonies and empire. They called for volunteers, and many joined up willingly. In 1905, mothers would rather see their sons go to prison than to war. 1914, they couldn't push their sons to the recruiting office fast enough. It was a particular type of loyalty and patriotism that existed then. Thank you, Rick. And not only throughout the empire, but in Newfoundland also. They came from all over the province, and Labrador was included, obviously. They came by way of train. Some walked, some by boat. Initially, most of the first to sign up were from the St. John's and Avalon region. It took a while for some of them to get St. John's to sign up. They came from all backgrounds. Some were fishermen, people who worked in the forest, people working in the mines, farmers. They were a tough breed, and they were their own individuals, I guess, if you want to use that word. Most of them never worked for anyone before, and they were quite fiercely independent, which proved to be an impediment when they joined the British Army. With the British armies, it's any army really, but back then, in particular, the British Army, discipline ruled the day, and it was something that they were not used to. Rick, I seem to be having issues with this. It won't advance. Okay, I'll have to do this. Okay. In St. John's in the Avalon area, there were several paramilitary organizations, usually church-based organizations. Here we have the Highlanders. I'm not sure what religion they were related to. Anglican, maybe, I don't know. Presbyterian, thank you, Anne. And yeah, okay, here we go. These would be the Methodist Guards. A lot of them signed up immediately. This would be the Catholic Cadet Corps. There were many Catholics in St. John's at that time, and they did form the nucleus. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And this would be the college company. I'm not sure what religion they would. Of course, then we have the CLB. There were quite a few of those guys. They were paramilitary. They had some woodwork, some map and compass, and some degree of shooting, discipline, a lot of sports, physical fitness was very important. But they were not trained in a military sense, especially with relation to what the British Army and their standards would expect. But they thought they were ready to go to war. We're going to win the war. And in their own minds, hey, we don't need training. We're going to go and we're going to do the work. Well, the majority of Newfoundlanders did sign up with the regiment. Some did sign up with the British Army. Some signed up with the British Navy, the Merchant Marine, and some signed up with the Canadian Air Force and Army and Navy. Some even signed up, very few, with the Americans. In fact, this is our Newfoundland Naval Reserve. We had our own Naval Reserve. They were active locally. This would be the vessel they trained on, called the Calypso. And if you want to see what's left of her, go to Lewisport. Her wreck still lies close to the shore. Anyway, the boys figured, they signed up, and we're going to do this, and we're going to go, and we're going to beat the Germans. And they, as everyone did, figured the war would be over by Christmas. It was August. The war was going to be over by Christmas. Right. They ended up in this camp, which is at Pleasantville. This is where the first 500 trained. Actually, it was a little over 600, but not all of them actually got on the boat to go overseas. Conditions here were not very good. Food was horrible. The sanitary conditions were absolutely horrible. But yet, they survived for 1 month, practically wearing the same clothes, but that was the nature, and they were all willing to do it. I haven't seen too many complaints on it. Again, these are the tents, and you see the boys, they're galley-lagging around doing something or other. I don't know if this screen can be seen with the light. Can we kill the lights, maybe? Rick, can you see the screens?
Oh, yes, that's fine, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Again, the training they received in Pleasantville, they figured, hey, this is enough. We're going to go and we're going to join the British Army, and that's it. We're going to go to war, and we're going to do what's expected of us. Now, just to indicate the independence of the Newfoundlanders, they even designed their own uniform. And they were going to go to Europe, and this is the uniform. You can see the slouch hat that was designed, well, it was taken from the Australian Army. You had the puttees, and they were actually blue, by the way. So the concept of this scarce material bit is not exactly true. They were designed to be blue. And you see the sword, which is, yeah, right. But they were going to go over. This was one man's concept. Now, the guy or the other officer next to him, usually coming from a fairly affluent family, he probably had his own uniform. But they did more or less establish a common uniform. And when the first 500 went over, they wore gray coats, and it's a good thing they did, because most of them had clothing that was unfit for public viewing and probably soiled. And of course, when they got over, the British Army took good care of them with regards to that. I'm not sure of this picture. I believe it's the first 500 and the day they left to march down to the Florizel and board that before they went overseas. It's quite an interesting picture. As you can see, it was, the crowd turned up to see them. This is indeed the first 500. It was taken in September of 1914, which is a few days before they left for France, or for Britain, I'm sorry. The officer on the left in the front is Con Alexander, and the officer next to him is Captain Rowley, who was the adjutant for quite a number of years with the regiment. He later, after the war, became a minister, and in the town where he grew up. After a stint, after with the Newfoundland Regiment, he joined the Indian Army, and once he left that, he joined the ministry. An interesting fellow. This is not the first 500. This is the second contingent to leave in winter of 1915. This is down by the former Newfoundland Hotel. And as you can see, there's quite a crowd turned out to see them. And I don't know I can't recall how many individuals were in the second contingent, but this would be a similar scene when the first 500 left. After they left St. John's, they went to Britain, and they went to Salisbury Plain for training. It was a good thing they did, because Salisbury Plain was a very muddy place, and it was good practice, because most of what they went to, especially the Passchendaele area, was basically a mud bath, and it was quite common for men and animals, horses in particular, to drown in mud, and it was not a good scene. Anyway, it didn't take long for the British to whip the Newfoundlanders into shape as much as they could, and I can only imagine now. You get some miner or some loggerman or fisherman working all his life independently, and finally he has some sergeant major in the British Army tell him to do something that he doesn't particularly want to do. But it did take them long. It didn't take them too long, and he soon got into the swing of it. Not fully, but they did learn what the word discipline was, and they were fiercely independent, very proud to be Newfoundlanders, did not want to be associated with the Canadians at all, and wanted to be set aside from them, but that was their nature. They were proud Newfoundlanders and independent. It didn't take long for the British to learn that. Leaving out a lot of stuff, information. A year later, oh, by the way, I should say that in September of 1915, early September, the boys, up to that time, they had signed on for 1 year, and after 1 year, they could go home. At that time, they were asked to sign up for the duration, as long as it took. Some did, some didn't. Well, I'm sorry, most did, some didn't. If you didn't, you were looked upon by your mates, by your comrades, as you know, a bit of a scallywag, and we don't like you. There were, yeah, I've seen many files, and there's some unprintable things where they refer to these individuals. As was at the time, if you were seen walking the streets of St. John's, or London for that matter, and you didn't have your slacker's pin on, which is what they call it, indicating you tried to sign off but you were turned down for medical reasons, they gave you this pin. Or if you didn't have a wound pin on, indicating you went overseas and wounded, so you were released on a medical. You had to be going around with some type of pin, because if you didn't, you would be frowned upon. In London, it was really bad, with gangs of women actually going around looking for these individuals. I've seen films where they're actually beating on these guys. So again, the men were expected to sign up and fight for the duration. Most did. Most did. Very shortly after they signed up for the duration, they were sent to Gallipoli on the night of September 19th and 20th, 1915. They landed on the beaches of Gallipoli. A lot of people don't really know that. And when you think of the regiment, you think of Beaumont Hamel. But before Beaumont Mal, they went to Gallipoli, and they fought the British and the Turks there. Again, a lot of history I'm leaving out. This is the beach where they landed. I can see why it took 2 hours to unload a little over 1,000 men on that beach. It's not very big. Again, this is the beach. It's very you can see the relative size to the small dinghy just outside. It's not very, very shallow. When they landed there, they were constantly bombarded by Turkish artillery, and they took casualties. Again, another picture of the beach. It's quite incredible, actually. Another view of the beach, and you can see how shallow the water was. Skipping. This is a barge, or what they called a lighter at the time. It was the only time landing craft was used in the First War. It's what's left of it. It's still there today, amazingly. These are the hills that the Newfoundlanders would have looked at in Gallipoli. The Turkish troops would have been on the crest or over that hill. The artillery would have been over the hill, but they had the guns ranged pretty good. They could land the shells right at the Newfoundlanders, and the Newfoundlanders did take some casualties. This would be the plane where the Newfoundlanders fought over, just quickly going through them. Excuse me, you can see this is Salt Lake right here, and the Newfoundlanders would have fought in this area. Again, a closer view of Salt Lake and the area behind. Over the hill is Silver Bay, where the Newfoundlanders landed. Again, another area. The conditions in Gallipoli changed from year to year, and of course there was a war going on there, so much of the ground was shelled and beat up. There were 49 casualties in Gallipoli. Walter McWhirter was the first casualty to die in combat, and as you can see, that the grave markers in Gallipoli are different from what you find in France. And there were 49 casualties. Not all are buried. I believe 8 or so were lost at sea, and buried at sea on the way to the hospitals at Montrose and Egypt. While in Gallipoli, this individual showed up on the scene, Lieutenant Colonel Haddo. He became an integral part of the regiment. He was the CO at Beaumont Hamel, and he was the longest serving commanding officer of the regiment, 20 months. He was an experienced officer. He spent 8 months in the Congo, not seeing a white man for that entire time. He was the district administrator there. He served as a machine gun commander in the Tibetan conflict, and I had the pleasure of staying with his grandson a year ago. Very interesting family, and yeah, I was just leave it at that. But he was a very interesting character. After Gallipoli, the boys went to France. On March 22nd, 1916, they landed in France. And in the months to follow, they rehearsed for the big push. Now, the big push was what the British and the French were hoping to do to drive the Germans back. And they they were planning it. Haddo knew that this was going to happen back in January. Just how and when, he didn't know. The British were still in the planning phases, and there were many options to choose from. The troops knew nothing. It was on a need-to-know basis. But they knew it was going to happen. In fact, the Germans knew it was going to happen because the British had publicized it in the newspapers. The big push is being planned. But no one knew when, especially the Germans. The Germans were getting prepared. They knew it was going to come. They just didn't know when. So it was planned for late June, the big push, the actual day. Prior to that, there was a raid on the 26th, 27th, led by Captain Bert Butler. Bert was what I call one of the heavy lifters of the regiment. He really did his bit. 3 weeks prior, he was tasked by Lieutenant Colonel Haddo to take 60 men and turn them into raiders. These would be people who would raid the trenches, cross no man's land, raid the trenches, try to determine the strength of the German trenches, make it back, and give the information back to the command, HQ. First raid, they weren't very successful. The Germans detected them, and they made it back. There was a raid on the second night, and that didn't turn out very well. It lasted 25 minutes. Captain Butler ordered his troop to retreat to an area which is now known as the Danger Tree. The losses for the second raid resulted in 4 men killed, 3 taken prisoner, and 21 wounded, 2 later dying from their wounds. So it wasn't a good thing, but they did something. As a result of 2 raids, they learned that the enemy trenches were intact, held in great strength, and the German wire in front of the lines was thick and intact. Raids conducted by other battalions in the area produced the same intelligence. This is an aerial map of Beaumont Mal as was taken by the RAF. You don't recognize that it's Beaumont Hamel, but it is. I used to know where the battlefield was in there. Unfortunately, I can't recall. This is Beaumont Mal as we see it today. It's a photograph of the Beaumont Hamel Memorial Park. And Captain Butler would have had to, and his raiding party would have had to, I can't get my pointer. Okay. Maybe I should go back, excuse me. Captain Butler would have had to leave these trenches here. This would be the front line trench right here. Leave these trenches, crawl down through his own wire, British wire, which would have been here, cross over no man's land, cross to the German wire to get into the German trenches, 40 feet at night, and at the risk of the Germans putting up a flare, which they did from time to time. And once the flare went up, well, everything broke out. Machine guns, snipers, grenades, everything were thrown at them. This individual showed up a couple of weeks before Beaumont Mal. He was placed second in command of the regiment, just under Lieutenant Colonel Haddo. This is Major, or Acting Major, James Forbes Robertson. He became an integral part of the regiment for a short period of time. It was he who was responsible for the training. He was like Haddo, he was a strict disciplinarian and a career officer. He later went on to win the Victoria Cross, and he was the hero at Monchy-le-Pieu who led 10 men for 11 hours against 3 battalions, an unknown story, but he did that. he was a very important part. This is a picture of both of them taken in late April of 1917. Forbes is on the left and Hadow is on the right. You notice they're wearing the caribou, although Forbes on the left was from the Norfolk Regiment and Hadow was from the Forbes was from the Border Regiment and Hadow on the left was from the Norfolk Regiment, but yet they're both wearing the caribou. A week prior to the actual invasion, which was supposed to be, the push was supposed to be June 29th, the British pulverized the German lines and the German wire, hoping to break the wire, and that will allow the British troops to get through fairly easily to the German lines. And Sergeant Charlie Parsons would later write, the general told us that if all the shells were put on motor lorries, they would extend about 40 miles, so that will give you an idea of the number of shells that we threw at the enemy. The bombardment was intense, but the Germans were very clever building dugouts. They had dugouts many feet below the surface and were quite safe. These are British dugouts. They're constructed fairly quickly. The Germans, the British were conducting an offensive war, so they didn't spend a lot of time building trenches that would stand up, because they didn't plan to stay there very long. That was their plan. These are German trenches. As you can see, they hold a few more creature comforts. They were well fortified. They have the duckboards to keep out of the mud on the bottom, and both sides. It's a little deeper, and they have the parapet, which was, you can see on the bottom left of the picture, that they could stand on and put the rifles over and shoot. So, you know, it's a fairly well-built trench. This is an example of something I found over there in one of the museums in France. On top, you see the battlefield. Underneath, you see a network of underground trenches and tunnels. This is something similar to what the Germans had at Beaumont Mal. And it's the same at Vimy, too. The British had a similar system at Vimy. But, you know, they were quite safe. They had lights, they had running water, they had sanitary conditions, they had everything except TV and internet. But, you know, they were quite safe, and in spite of the shelling that the British threw at them, they survived. June 29th didn't happen due to rain, and so the actual attack took place on July the 1st. It's not really called the Battle of Beaumont Mal. It's called the Battle of the Somme, which lasted from July 1st to November of 1916. But within the Battle of the Somme, there were many engagements. July 1st was the initial one, although we tend to call it the Battle of Beaumont Mal. It's one engagement. The artillery stopped a few hours before 0 hour on July 1st, and the actual invasion was, or the actual start of the engagement was supposed to be at 7:30, and the 252nd Royal Engineers had built a tunnel, which is something that engineers did at the time. Most of these people were former miners, come out of Wales and so on. So they were experts at living and working underground. As was common, each of the enemy would tunnel under no man's land, and underneath their own, the enemy's trenches, and place mines, explosives. And when the appropriate hour came, they just blow them up, and that's that. Everyone feared them, and it's quite often when the tunnelers were actually digging, they could hear the enemy digging a few feet beyond them, and often they dug into one another's trenches. So it was a whole underground war. Anyway, this was built by the 252nd engineering company, and it was built right under German lines. And this is taken from the British front line, so you can imagine the size of it. This is the one you see in all the war documentaries. It's at Beaumont Mal. The mine was supposed to be blown at 7:30. But someone decided to blow it at 7:20, and there were a lot of reasons why that was the case. We won't get into them, time is limited. By blowing it at 7:20, there was a clear message, especially a mine of this size, and since the artillery had stopped, and this mine going on, was a clear message to the German, this is the big push. They were ready, and they were quick to react. But of course, it went at 7:20, and nothing happened for 10 minutes. So this gave the Germans a fair bit of time to get ready. 7:30, the British troops moved off. That was the start of it. By the way, this explosion was caused by 40,600 pounds of ammonal, high explosive, and it created quite a concussion. This is the hole that was left after it went. As you can see, it's quite a dent in the surface. Quite a number of Germans were lost when that mine went up. A terrible way to go. Captain Sidney Frost would later write, the troops were assured by all the commands that this was almost a walkover. They had bombarded for a week before, and all the wire was to have been destroyed, and there was tremendous confidence. That's the wire that was supposed to be destroyed. There's also the wire that the raiders had to go through with the wire cutters, and so it was not what you call an easy task. With the British front wire, the British had gaps cut in their front wire, and they were marked so the British would know how to get through their own wire in front of their own lines. Now, it wasn't just a straight cut, because the Germans would see the straight cut. The wire, the gaps, the path through the wire would be zigzag, so the Germans could not clearly see where the cut was. So to get through that, go over no man's land, they would have to blow the German wire so that they could get through. Problem was, that was the standard shell used by the British. Those are shrapnel balls in the middle. I forget how many is in there last time I counted them, but problem is, the shrapnel shell is designed to kill men. It's not designed to break wire. It usually exploded around 40 feet above the surface. It was fused to do that, and it would send shrapnel everywhere, and whoever was in front of them, those shrapnel balls. France is littered with those. There's no problem to find those shrapnel balls. But it does very little to destroy wire. So in spite of all the shelling that Captain Frost refers to, not much happened. Another reason why the shelling didn't work, there were a lot of duds. Shell production was increased in Britain so much that they were pushing the stuff out so quickly, quality control sort of went to the wayside. And also a lot of the people in the munitions factories had signed up, so you had a lot of inexperienced individuals working in the factories. A lot of women, and nothing against women here, but sorry, Anne, but yeah, they were not skilled in doing this particular trade. And the common, whenever a dud came over, the common phrase was, some poor Phyllis did it to me again. So all female workers in munition factories were known as Phyllis. They had a common name. In spite of the trials that the troops went through, they did maintain a certain amount of humor. I guess they had to, you know. The first wave went over. They were the 2nd South Wales Borderers and the 1st Royal Inniskillings Fusiliers. Left the safety of their trench at 7:30. They were met by a hail of machine gun fire and heavy shelling. The attack was over in 5 minutes. That's all they lasted. Most of the casualties occurring in the narrow gaps in the enemy's wire because it had not been broken. Some of the Royal Inniskillings Fusiliers did manage to make it to the enemy lines, but most of them were killed or taken prisoner. At 7:35, the second wave went over. They consisted of the 1st King's Own Scottish Borderers and the 1st Border Regiment. Most were mowed down as they attempted to enter the gaps in their own wire. The Germans were now more prepared for them. A small number of the Borders did make it to German lines, but they were suffered the same fate as the previous comrades. What happened now, the dead and the wounded. I should talk about the first wave. Captain Sidney Frost would later write, the first wave went over at early in the morning at 7:30. We did notice something had gone wrong. We didn't know quite what. As soon as the shelling lifted, they swarmed up these dugouts, and when the troops went in, they had no barrage, no protective barrage, that is their own British barrage, of any kind to keep the enemy machine gunners down. It didn't work out at all. Now, I should explain something here. Newfoundland Trench, they were here. They were the 3rd in line, or the reserve units, together with the Essex Regiment. This is the current day Caribou. This row here was roughly the 2nd line. The front line is right here. This is where the first wave left from. This would be where the second wave left from. And the Newfoundlanders were back here in the 3rd line. The British front wire was just in front of the British front line, about right here. There's the danger tree where we noticed. This would be no man's land. The German trenches were here, and they would have their own wire right here. So the first and second wave had gone over. At 8:45, a verbal order was received by Lieutenant Colonel Haddo. It read as follows: 1st Essex and 1st Newfoundland Regiment will advance as soon as possible. As soon as possible being key words. The commanding officer of the 1st Essex requested permission to lay the events in order to clear the communication trenches. His request was granted. A little strange. This is not at Beaumont Hamel, but it's an example of the support trenches. By the way, the 1st and 2nd and 3rd lines will be connected by communication trenches to allow troops to advance or retreat to their reserve lines. What happened, these communication trenches became congested with dead and the dying and first aid people and the medics working on the wounded soldiers. They became congested. You can imagine you had 4 battalions that had gone in the 1st and 2nd waves. So you're talking, a couple of thousand, probably 1,000, 1,500 casualties, maybe 1,000 coming back. I mean, there was just no room. They were walking over one another. So the Essex said, no, we can't get up through this. Can we delay it until we clear the trenches? To do otherwise would have meant going over the top, getting to the front line, getting through the wires, getting down through no man's land, and trying to enter German wire and German trenches. The idea was to go up to the communication trenches and jump off from the first line. The Essex said, well, hold it now, we're not going to jump off the 3rd line, so he requested permission, and he got it. The following communication took place between Lieutenant Colonel Haddo and brigade. He did not talk to brigade personally. He received a telephone, the adjutant off the rally, Captain Raleigh, received a phone call and relayed the information to Haddo. So something may have gotten lost in communication. Haddo says, does as soon as possible mean independently of the Essex, or will we have to work together? He knew that the Essex had received permission. So he's saying, okay, do we want us to move now independently, or will we have to go together? Brigade said, go as soon as you can, independently. So that was his order. Today, people will sit in their armchairs and say, and debate that ad nauseum, and say he made the right decision, he made the wrong decision. And, you know, he received an order. And if you didn't follow a legal order, and it was a legal order, you'd be court-martialed. He would have been, his military career would have been finished. And so he obeyed his order. But before he went, he said, has the enemy's front line been captured? And the reply was, the situation has not been cleared up. So he went. As I said, people will, oh, he made the wrong decision, oh, he made the right decision. But as a commanding officer and a senior officer, he knew one thing. He knew that the one thing that was all the other COs and all the battalions along that 35-mile front. And that was, if he didn't go, a hole would have been opened up in that line, and it would have given the Germans an opportunity to move ahead and flank the attacking battalions on each side of that gap. Every commanding officer knew that. He had to go. And why the Essex received this delay, no one knows. If you read the Essex War Diary, you get a different story. If you read the Newfoundland War Diary, you get this. I don't know. I don't like to put words in people's mouths who lived 100 years ago, and I don't like to judge their actions. These guys were there. I wasn't. So I can only take their word for it. Captain Sidney Frost, after the Newfoundlanders left. Now, you have to remember the Newfoundlanders, instead of going through communication trenches up to the second line and up to the first line and then jumping off into German sites, they jumped off from the third reserve position. So they had to go over ground to the second position, to the first line, and then enter no man's land. So they were attacked from the moment they got out of the reserve position. Captain Sidney Frost says later on, advancing in waves in broad daylight at 9 o'clock in the morning with machine guns playing on you from all directions, it was an impossible situation. Our battalion was wiped out before we got to our own front line. To get to our own wire where gaps had been cut, we had to form in single line in sections, and as they gathered into this formation, they were caught by machine guns and shells and everything else. And these gaps became clogged with dead and wounded men. And they either had to remove them or step over them or try to get through somewhere else. One of the recommendations that the raiding parties brought back, and of course High Command did not listen, in fact they didn't believe anything the raiding parties brought back, was that there wasn't enough gaps cut in their own British wire. So you had troops moving forward in lines fairly well spaced, but in order to get through their own wire, they had to congest onto the few gaps in the wire. And when they came out the other end, all the German machine gunners had to do was just lock on. There was 5 to 9 machine guns trained on the Newfoundlanders. So all they had to do was just lock on this part of their own British trench where the Newfoundlanders were coming out and just fire away. That's all they had to do. This is a German's Maxim machine gun. Fires 450 rounds a minute. It's water cooled, and it was very accurate, and German machine gunners were extremely well trained. In fact, the British Army was basically an army of volunteers. When Germany entered the war, they had 4 million trained soldiers. Each one was required to do 2 years training, and after that they were required to go back every 2 years for a period of retraining for about 1 month. So they had 4 million trained soldiers, and they were very well adapted in the use of this weapon. I read reports where it's water-cooled, where they fired some, they were firing so much ammunition, not constantly squeezing the trigger and pouring out 450 rounds a minute because the machine gun would melt, but firing it in periodic spurts. The water boiled to the point where it just blew, there's a pressure release valve on it, it blew it, so all the water steamed out. They used various forms of liquid. I won't get into some of the liquid they used because they had run out of water. Then they tried taking the jacket off, the water jacket, and they kept on firing anyway. Each rifle barrel is bored to cause the shell to spin and go in a straight line. And after so many rounds, you had to change the barrel. They were changing the barrel like every 15 minutes, every 20 minutes, and they actually had spare barrels. The machine gun, I read reports from the machine gunners who later wrote about that experience. Machine gun came so hot, their fingers were blistered from the heat, just pulling on the trigger. That's how much heat was generated from the use of these machine guns. And one thing that I noted that the German machine gunners, they knew they had a job to do, they knew if they didn't do it, what would happen to them, but they couldn't believe what the British were doing. They were just straight down. Incredible. Private Howard Morey. It was a lovely morning, pretty quiet, but the very minute they got over the top, the very minute they started, well, you wouldn't know what had happened. You couldn't see anything, only dust and smoke and shells bursting, bits of rag and sticks and everything going up in the air. You couldn't see a thing, not a thing. Again, you can see the if you see the pointer, they would have, the Newfoundlanders came from this line over the top in full view to the secondary line. Now the secondary line is the high point of this whole battle scene. They came to the pointer's not working very well, to the front line, across no man's land, although some of them, most of them didn't get there. This is a side view of the terrain. Beaumont Mal. This St. John's Road, where the British, where the Newfoundlanders were situated. This would be the support trench for the second line, and the front line would be right here. So the Newfoundlanders couldn't see what was actually happening on the battlefield because the second line was higher. But nevertheless, a lot of casualties were occurred here. The German machine gunners were so good, they knew where the third line was, so they would act their machine guns over, so that they would nail the Newfoundlanders coming out of the trenches. And they knew. Plus the German artillery were concentrated in this area also. 50% of the casualties of Beaumont Mal caused by a machine gun, the other 50 by German artillery. So they couldn't really see the German lines, or they couldn't see their own British wire, the British front line. All the Newfoundlanders saw was the second. And I have a good picture here of today. This is what the Newfoundland, as I said, the secondary line, the support trenches, is right by the Caribou. This is the view that the Newfoundlanders would have seen from their own line. They couldn't see over that hill. But the Germans, as I said, were knocking the artillery into them, and they had the machine guns arced. Even though the Germans couldn't see them, they just arced the machine gun to lay down the fire. This is another view from the position where the Newfoundlanders were. Again, you can see the secondary line, but you can't see the support line or the German trenches. So you can only imagine, most of them didn't even make it to their own front line. So you can only imagine the look in the Newfoundlanders' faces when they got to the secondary line and saw the devastation that was before them. This is taken from the Caribou, which is the secondary line. The front line runs along here. It's not too far, but the camera lens puts it here. This is the danger tree. This is Waberdeen Cemetery. The German line was right here. So when he went over the top, the Germans had a clear view. All they had to do, what Newfoundlanders made it to their front line, all they had to do was just aim at the gaps, leave the machine gun there, just far away. All of this, they were totally exposed. The Germans were well dug in. As you can see, this is the support line, this is the front line. This is a German shell, somewhat similar to the British shell, only the shrapnel pieces were a bit bigger and would cause much more damage to the human body. Lieutenant Ken Goodyear. We went over 4 abreast, 60 men in all, down to the gaps that were made of the barbed wire. Because you see, the thing is, the Germans had their machine guns trained exactly on those gaps. Those gaps were marked with white tape and rock. We were just sitting ducks, nothing more or less. But I'm going to tell you this, the boys did not falter one iota. They just marched in this thing as though they were going on parade, and they knew they were going to their deaths, the vast majority of them. And they came through from our own trench and into no man's land. They were all knocked over, knocked off. So they knew. And, you know, you got to wonder, like, if I were there, would I turn around? Well, he couldn't. He'd be shot. You have the military police and the regimental owned MPs, as provosts they call them, they would shoot you if you turn around. But I suspect a lot of them didn't turn around for shame. You wouldn't want to go to get back home that you cowered out. I suspect that was the motivation too. Plus, a lot of them knew they had to do a job, but a lot of them knew that this was based on those that went before them that day. Lieutenant Ken Goodyear later went on to say, I got out into no man's land and I got hit by the place known as the Old Danger Tree. He was one of the ones to get further out. It was a sort of landmark between the German trenches and our own. And anyone who got there got killed or hit anyhow. I was hit about 50 feet to the left of that, and lying there in no man's land was just bullets going crazy and shells flying and men dying around you. You could smell blood like a slaughterhouse. My water bottle had been shot out away, and you know, even before we went over, we were thirsty. The thirst became intolerable almost, your tongue swollen in your mouth. Again, I said earlier, I like to use the words of the men who were there. They were there, I wasn't. This is the danger tree. It's the reasonable facsimile, it's not the actual tree. I'm told that the tree was actually an apple tree, but I'm not going to waste time debating that. Ken Goodyear went on to say, I had 60 men in my bombing section, and among them were some of the fondest men I ever knew. To give you an idea how devoted we were to each other, just prior to going over the top, Paddy O'Brien, who was my sergeant and one of the fondest men that ever drew a breath of life. Isn't that a fantastic way to describe a person? He said to me, he said, sir, he said, you lead and we'll follow through hell and back. I took 60 men into hell. 3 of us came out, Paddy O'Brien, Ben Forsey, and myself. Charlie Parsons. I remember in one gap alone, we counted 66 dead. 17 of us went over under Lieutenant Miller, and at nightfall, there were but 2 of us left. This will give you an indication from those who were there. Frost also tells us They had a disc, a tin disc made out of tin biscuits on each man's back so that the intelligence officers and the airplanes and so forth would see just where they were and distinguish our troops from enemy troops and all this. The disc attached to his back when he was wounded, if he turned over the disc and tried to make his way back to his own lines, this would shine in the bright sunlight and snipers, German snipers, would get him. So he couldn't crawl in. He just had to wait there until dark, and by that time a lot of these poor men had died. But even in the nighttime, when they tried to call back, the Germans would send up flares. The flares would reflect the light from the tins. Bang, bang, bang. And again, it was psychologically, from research I've done, Germans, it took a toll on the Germans too, psychologically, to be doing this. It was just like shooting fish in water. After it was over, Charlie Parsons and I went out, again from Private Howard Morey. Charlie Parsons and I went out after night picking up the wounded and dead. In the day you could hear fellows calling out for help out of the shell holes, but once night fell, they weren't calling anymore. An occasional fellow was off his head. You'd hear him moan, but most of the fellows kept very quiet, afraid the Germans would come over and shoot them, you see. And you had to crawl down into the shell holes and feel around, feel whether a fellow was dead or living. I've read that the most common saying from a dying man in the first war was "Mom." His last words. When it was all over, and I've been leaving out a lot of things, but when it was all over, High Command steps in and try to console everyone and encourage the troops, and dish out the medals. And although Hanno didn't dish out a lot of medals for Beaumont Mal, it was felt that every man did such a great job, he couldn't single out a particular individual. He did give a medal to Butler for doing the raids, and to the medics. He gave the medals to the medics. But for the troops, because the medics went out in severe circumstances, often unarmed because they couldn't take a rifle to get troops in. But to the infantry who went out that day, and most died or became casualties, were wounded, every one of them deserves a medal, and I can't give them all. That was decided. But of course the generals stepped in, and they said, okay, Brigadier General Delisle of the 29th Division to which the Newfoundlanders belong, no fault can be found with the behavior of the troops who did all that was possible. Their bravery and the severity of the engagement are best evidenced by the casualties I regret were very severe. That was printed in the local papers. It was noticeable that in spite of the 2 attacks having failed on the right, the 2 battalions detailed for the 3rd attack behaved with exemplary behavior, the Newfoundlanders and the Essex. This example of discipline and valor was equaled by others, but cannot be surpassed. I can tolerate that. The one that really gets to me, and I guess it's overused, it irritates me to some extent, but I don't think this would console the mother of who lost her son, at Beaumont Mal. It was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault failed only because dead men can advance no further. It's probably true. Yes, it is true. But I don't think it consoled many of the mothers who received news 2 weeks after July 1st. Oh yeah, it was like the reports, initial reports that came back, big success. 2nd and 3rd and 4th news started, a little bit of news started to filter in. And it wasn't until 2 weeks later. Clergymen were quite busy going door to door, knocking on doors, offering their condolences. And instead of getting a letter in the mail, you had to go down to the post office and look at the list, the casualty list. That's how you found out whether your son survived or not. Hard stuff. I like this. This is a page out of Lieutenant Colonel Haddo's diary. And he was there, I wasn't. There's the number, only 68 unwounded men reported. So there's your number. Not made up, it's there. But notice the last two words above that. The whole page he talks about the battle. I'm not going to go read it, but notice the last two words, we lost. So in spite of all the words that came out of General Delisle and so on, Haddo sums it up, we lost. Before I go any further, I forgot to mention that the Newfoundlanders were a homegrown regiment of volunteers, like many of the regiments that came out of Britain, their own the Lancashires, the Essex, and the Norfolk, all the various towns and so on formed their own regiments. Newfoundland formed their own regiment also, all volunteers. In Gallipoli, they survived. Haddo realized that he needed to train them. They weren't ready for war. And he was not popular with the men. He was strict officer to work under. And to give you an idea of the Newfoundland attitude, Haddo tried, when they went to Egypt after Gallipoli to rebuild the regiment and before they went to France, he would take them on route marches in the desert because and firing exercise. It was not safe to discharge firearms in such a populated area where they were billeted. The Newfoundlanders didn't like walking in the heat. So a lot of them would fall out, which you're not supposed to do. So he took their names and he dealt with it. Anyway, the men didn't like it, so Haddo was going on leave one day, and when he walked out of his tent, there were a number of the regimental fellows who booed him. You don't do that in the military. You don't boo your commanding officer. But Newfoundlanders did. And but again, it's not. I'm not belittling us. It's just the way we thought. It's not a democracy. They hadn't accepted the fact that this is the military. We're doing it our way. But Haddo dealt with it. When he came back from leave, he said, I'm going to deal with this myself. He didn't bring it up the line. And when he got back, he was presented with 4 petitions wanting their old CO back. It's not a democracy, it's the military. They didn't see it that way. And but he noticed one thing. He said that 4 petitions were all in the same handwriting. So he found the culprit and promptly court-martialed him. But he let him off the hook just to prove a point. I brought him to France, and as I said earlier, from March up to the July 1st, we trained him and trained him and trained him. He knew, as a career officer, that in order to win the war, he knew he had to train these men to fight and win that war. But he also knew that I got to keep them alive. They need to know how to be kept alive, to work in the field, the various tactics, not getting shot, and things like that. Well, once you overcome that, then you got to forge ahead, and you've got to defeat the enemy. And he knew he had to do that, and he did it with the help of Forbes, Robertson. After Beaumont Hamel, the regiment was not decimated because they would keep 10% before a battle. They kept 10% behind to rebuild the regiment should the regiment be pretty well wiped out. So, or the battalion, I should say. Sorry. The men morale was low, and Forbes, Robertson, and Haddo put them to work with training immediately. The boys didn't like it. They wanted to sit around and say, like, this is not good. And they kind of didn't want to go on. But Haddo and Forbes realized, we got to push them. And they did. And sure enough, 4.5 months later at Goudecourt, which was one of the last battles of the Battle of the Somme, Newfoundlanders were well prepared. They went in a small force of 357 men. 357 men. Killed or wounded 250 of the enemy and took 75 prisoners, 357 men, and they lost 250 of their own. But they went ahead and did it, and I've read many accounts. It was payback time. That may not be something you like to hear, but a lot of them were avenging their friends, and that was the mentality at the time. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that this homegrown regiment eventually became a force to be reckoned with through training and experience. And the men that were over there that survived trained and assisted the younger men or the newer recruits coming over, and their experience was passed on. The 29th Division, the Newfoundlanders was signed to the 29th Division, which was a crack, hardcore regiment consisting of experienced, hardcore soldiers. They were career soldiers. And all of a sudden, we got this homegrown regiment thrown in, a colonial regiment, no less. But, you know, the Newfoundland Regiment earned a place of respect in that division. And the stories are countless, and the accolades are countless, too many to repeat here. So there I went ahead. I'm going to read a letter that was written in the early 30s by Private Arthur F. Osmond, number 1131. Sometime, okay, I'm sort of missed a page. Well, yes, I wanted to, excuse me. I don't know how this happened. I think it went ahead on its own, didn't it? Bear with me, please. Okay. So much for technology. Can't get in there. Okay, here we go. Private Osmond would later write, "Some time ago you asked me to write a statement of what I went through in the Newfoundland Regiment. I will do so to the best of my knowledge, but it's hard for me to sit down and write for what I endured in the war." On that terrible night, Private Osmond was on one of the raiders in the raiding party under Captain Butler. I was one of the men at Beaumont Mal with Captain Butler in charge when we beat our way to the German front line. We put up a wonderful fight. I heard the screams from the Germans when they first heard us. And on July the 1st was more than I could stand. Bullets flying everywhere. Within a couple of 100 yards from the German lines, I got a bullet through my right lung, and I thought I was up. I was a bomber at that time with 20 Mills bombs around me. Mills bomb at that time is what we later called a grenade. I was down with bullets flying all around me. It was a hard sight. Anyway, I kept my head, and the first thing that I did was to get clear of the bombs, which I rolled from my neck. At that time, I was bleeding a lot. Most of the blood came from my mouth on account of me breathing. I knew if I stayed there, I would die, so I started to get back by hauling myself along with one arm, for my right arm could not move, and bullets sticking in the ground everywhere all around me. Sometime that day, I got back to our trenches. Just as I was rolling in, Captain Summers came to my rescue. There in our trenches were full of the dead and wounded soldiers. Captain Summers helped me in our trench, and he got behind me and put his arms up under my arms and helped me into a dugout where the Red Cross attended me. I knew nothing more until daylight the following morning. For 12 days, I was on the serious list, more dead than alive. get a load of this. In February of 1917, I went to the front again, where I spent a terrible hard time. So, I mean, here he is, he gets shot in the lungs, they take him back, patch him up, and throw him back in. Wouldn't be done today. He was captured at Monchy-le-Pieu on April 14th, 1917, and spent the rest of the war in captivity. Charlie Parsons pretty well sums it up. Human life was so cheap, it was the most expendable of all military equipment. The horse or a mule had much more consideration paid to it than a soldier. I know, because when I came back and being wounded wasn't for active service, I was put in charge of transport, which involved dealing with a lot of horses. And I knew that there was more attention paid to a sick mule or a horse that died than to a human being that died. There were more questions asked. He said he was there. I wasn't. Today, this is the battlefield of Beaumont Hamel. You can see it's pot marked with a lot of shell holes. As time goes on, another 100 years, it's going to be perfectly flat. Right now, the engineers are trying to figure out a way to keep it the way it is. It's going to be an expensive project, but it's amazing how time erases the valves. This is the Y ravine. You can see it's pretty deep, but again, that's sort of coming out to a level field. Again, this is the area overlooking the Newfoundland. Newfoundland trenches would have been in here. Here we have the parking lot for the park just outside. The caribou would be to our back here. Excuse me. Picture of the Y ravine again. Again, this is the caretaker's residence. Again, you can see the shell marks, shell holes still there. A communication trench still there. It's funny, it's not funny actually, but it's unique. This is a memorial for the 29th Division. The 29th Division's patch was the red triangle, and all the Newfoundlanders wore that. They chose Beaumont Mal to place their memorial to the division. All the places they could have chosen, they chose the park of a colonial reserve regiment. I thought that was pretty neat. Even though the battlefields are fading and the farmland has taken over much of the previous battlefields, time is running by and we tend to forget. There's one thing that you're not going to forget over there. These signs are all over the place. No entry on detonated explosives. And they're still going off. There's fewer and fewer happening as each year goes by, but there are still explosives going off. And they're finding more and more. In fact, French farmers find so much of it, they put it on the roadside. And they have 6 demolition teams from the French Army go around and pick it up and get rid of it safely. But it's not an uncommon sight to see a load of ordnance on the side of a road that was picked over by the farmers. This is the caribou in Beaumont Hamel overlooking the battlefield. It's a pretty unique monument. As far as I know, we're the only regiment that has more than one monument. There's 5 caribous. There's another monument. That's a close-up view of the 29th Division Memorial. This is the plaque located under the caribou at Beaumont Mal. It contains the names of some of the reserve Navy guys, and it contains the names of the Newfoundlanders who were never found missing in action. And this plaque is now duplicated in Bourne Park. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but you go to the park and see the exact same plaque now that exists in Beaumont Mal. It's pretty neat. So there's 4 caribous in Europe, 4 in France, 1 in Belgium. You saw the Beaumont Mal one. This is the one in Cambrai, which was another location that Lieutenant Colonel Lieutenant Colonel Nangle thought that the Newfoundlanders excelled. This Coup de Corps, which was the first battle after, or the first engagement after the after July 1st, Beaumont Mal, and it was the one where the regiment came into its own, because from here on in, they really distinguished themselves in what they had to do. This is Monchy Le Pew in 1923. That's Dr. Keegan on the bottom. His son was Kevin Keegan. That's as it was then. This is as it is now. This is Courtrai, Belgium, as it was then, as it is now. There's a bullet hole in this particular caribou as a result of some trigger-happy person with a rifle. Won't tell you where it is, but fortunately they haven't fixed it yet. I'm going to leave the last words to Lieutenant Colonel Jocelyn Driscoll. Best of Newfoundland's manhood were killed that day. The men that really should be running the country today, because as you know, they were volunteers, and the best people in any country are the volunteers, and they were the first people to be wiped out. It was a terrific calamity to Newfoundland. Truer words can never be spoken. He later became the regiment, regimental CO in 1949, when the regiment was reformed again. Sorry if I went over. Forgive me.
So interesting, and I know that Alex and and David have their presentation as well. Are you quite used to shrinking or stretching as needed to be to fill time? So interesting, though. I really appreciate it, Tony. It's great, and we have some people online, but and here in the room as well. So I'm just going to inquire if anyone has any question or comment to make before we move on to the next presentation. We won't take an official break. People can come and go and get what they would need or like themselves. But I'm just going to unmute people online, if I can, and they have themselves muted, to see if there are any particular questions or comments from anyone. Anyone here with a question? One of the things that I'm a little bit curious about is the roles that some of the people who were trained, like in CLB and other, I suppose, groups of one sort or another, did any of them take on any leadership roles in the moving up to the ranks and as they got moved from being volunteers in community groups here, to use that word for it, into organized military under the British?
So within the Newfoundland Regiment or moving on to other regiments?
Or to other regiments, yes.
Yeah.
But within the Newfoundland Regiment particularly.
Well, within the regiment, most of the officer corps consisted of the business class or the I wouldn't say the working class, but the business class. It's fairly affluent individuals at St. John's and most of St. John's surrounding areas. But that's not to say that these guys did not carry their weight. These guys were leaders, and they seemed to be natural leaders. I don't know why, maybe because of their education, but several of them excelled at what they were doing. But there were others who came up through the ranks and distinguished themselves. So, you know, it was sort of a mixed bag, I could say.
Good. Thanks, Tony. Any question from anyone? Please unmute yourself if you have yourself muted. Any question from anyone online? Any comments from others here?
It's an incredible story.
Isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
I apologize for going over.
No, you know,
story to be told.
It's a story to be told, and one thing I want to say on behalf of all of us who are participating today and those who are viewing online, Tony, is that we know that you declare yourself not a professional historian, that you can bring a great perspective from as a proud Newfoundlander and a person who's intrigued by the facts and the stories that probably would never have been told, and people whose names would never be mentioned. And you know, I don't know if it's my own age or what, but you draw attention, you know, to the messages that would be coming to the mothers and how things were sometimes simplified and what have you. And every one of them, I worked for most of my career in the area of pastoral care and counselling and grief counselling, and wow, there's, to be aware of the immense tragedy in the whole province as people were losing their children, their brothers or sisters and what have you. And you mentioned that the dying words of so many was Mom. What a reminder that is to us.
And they were some of them were over 4.5 years. It wasn't like all 6 months stint or 6-month doors. Some of them were 4.5 years under the worst conditions anyone has ever seen.
A lot of them were kids too, with the number of boy soldiers who volunteered.
Anyway, Tony, here's a little loot bag from us at Queen's. Thank you for your attendance and participation, and others will enjoy it, I might say, as they view it online. So we're going to slip right along now to Dr. Alex Fazarek and to Dr. David Mal, who will do the presentation as I have asked them on graceful remembering. So if you just give me a moment, I'll open their file somewhere, hopefully.
I'm on a real tight schedule. I have to leave exactly at past. Tomorrow's no problem, but today's tight.
Okay. And here it is. So that's what you see. I'll bring it up a little bit more so we get a bit of fuller screen maybe. Okay. Didn't help. Okay. So you can use it here as you want. Okay. Good. Or maybe you might shrink it a bit so that you make the full thing. So I'm going to go and check it out on the other computer, but you can continue on. And maybe we might turn off the camera because it's going to be a bit of a distraction for to be seeing side of one of your heads and none of the rest of you. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And the previous presentation in the room was phenomenal and very well appreciated by the attenders here. And when we get into this part of the presentation, Rick wanted us to speak on graceful remembrance of on the anniversary of war, and Dr. David Bell and I will be doing it. I would say that we can very quickly have the ungracefulness sometimes of some of these remembrances. Sometimes we can get into way things which are over the top, and not that I want to criticize our neighbors to the south, but I've been at presentations and various types of remembrance ceremonies on both Memorial Day in the United States, which of course is coming up at the end of the month, but also Armistice Day. And I think it's more of a glorification of war than a remembrance of the dead. Whereas I think in Canada and in Newfoundland, we tend to be more mindful of the sacrifice which has gone on previously. So I'm getting ahead of myself. But what I'd like to do is to ask, oh, by the way, if you want a copy of the presentation, just email me and I'll be more than pleased to send it along. But from the first aspect, let's ask us, what are we remembering? What are we commemorating? What are we trying to accomplish on these particular days? And to go back into history, look at what happened to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, back in 1982. Of course, there was the completion of the Falkland Island War, and Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister at the time, wanted a great celebration in St. Paul's Cathedral, and she wanted it done on the scale of VE Day, Victory in Europe, or VJ Day, Victory in Japan. So there was supposed to be dancing in the streets. They were supposed to show how great the British Empire was. People were singing Rule Britannia. All these things were being so much. And what did Robert Runcie do? Now, Robert Runcie was already in a bit of hot water with the British government. He had objected to how the Iron Lady was controlling the British economy. He was vilified as being a leftist in the face of very austere political and economic conditions which were being done. And he was then at the conclusion of this particular war to pray for not only the British soldiers which had fallen, but also for the Argentinian civilians which had been affected, for the Argentinian military, but also for the Falkland Islanders. His was one of reconciliation. It wasn't that over-the-top particular part there. So when we try to do things, let us remember that we're not there to glorify war. We're there to remember the dead. We're there to remember the sacrifice. But we're there to make sure that there is a healing which is going to be done. I would also suggest that any liturgy which we do is going to be a Christian liturgy and not a state-inspired liturgy. So we cannot necessarily have things done by a politician controlling these sorts of things. Now, we're going to get together with politicians because obviously they're the ones who have contributed to the war effort through the financing, the recruitment, and all the particular parts which are the like. We have to remember those who have died to pay the ultimate sacrifice, but also we have to remember those who survived, because people do come back, and ultimately they do come back in a broken state, and the reintegration becomes very important. So when we look at these particular parts, we have to give thanksgiving for the ones who came back when remembering those who have died. When we go through a liturgy, is it an obligation or is it a blessing? Yes, it's an obligation in that we should remember these things. If you've ever heard the longer version of Waltzing Matilda with the ones who have gone off to war, and then later on at the end of the song, the person sitting on his porch watching all these people going back and forth, and the young people ask, what are they marching for? What's the purpose of that? To a certain extent, we had forgotten Beaumont Hamel. But what happens, we of course have the Afghan conflict. We have all the 9/11 events, and the military is at the forefront once again. We have modern day soldiers who have gone off in the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And of course, if you look in some of the newer subdivisions, there's streets which are named after them. So all these things become very important. It's an obligation, but it's a blessing to remember where we've come from, to see where we can be going, to cherish our rights and freedoms by the sacrifices which have then been made. So whenever we do these things, let's make sure that there's some good do's and don'ts which are going to be done. Because ultimately, good liturgy is going to be that purgative elements. Don't do things which you ought not to do. And it's going to be additive to those things which you ought to do. And of course, we have confessional, which are built around that. So I would suggest that we, first of all, it's a necessity of being a Christian liturgy. Christian liturgies, of course, are marked by prayer. They're marked by scriptural readings. They're marked by periods of reflection on these. And of course, if you have a good band or singers, to have the liturgy of music, because that brings through. Of course, we can have nationalist things, such as the national anthem and the Ode to Newfoundland, which becomes very important. I would suggest one of our first basic Christian responses, and something which we can never do without, is prayer. Prayer is how we respond to the situations. And I think ACTS, this whole acronym, I think can become very important. We have to have adoration because we do have a deity who is in charge. And it's very important to us. We have a Savior, so let's always remember these particular parts there. Confessional. War is not something which God wants, but we have to remember that we're confessing for having gone to war. And of course, when we get into war crimes, those who have waged aggressive warfare are perhaps the most which are then going to be culpable. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving that we're no longer in the conflict. Thanksgiving for the people who have come back. Thanksgiving for the state of nature which we're currently enjoying. That life, that freedom, the land in which we live. But also supplication. We have to ask for something at this particular point. So when we go through the liturgy and we're doing the praying, it must, of course, reflect scriptures. Now, Are we going to incorporate this into existing liturgy? Do we do it as a morning prayer or Eucharist and evening prayer? We can, and it's very easy to do that particular part, in which case we incorporate these elements of prayers into the prayer of the people. We have the opening sentence, which sets the tone for the day, and then we have an extra Eucharistic part to say that we're celebrating this Eucharist on behalf of these particular people, and then to wrap it up at the end with the blessing for that particular day. We can incorporate the state prayers either through the BAS or the BCP. Sometimes in congregations, the BCP might actually be more relevant to people, because that would have been the prayer book in force at that particular time. Well, actually, it would have been the 1662 Book of Common Prayer from the British, which the 1959-62 BCP really is. Canada, of course, adopted its first prayer book in 1918, but that wasn't in use at this particular time. You should also then, when you're looking at the prayers, either BAS or BCP, participation, not only of church people, so the people we would normally have there, but make sure that the armed forces are involved. Last year in Pooch Cove, we had various people from the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Army, which were involved. Of course, the Legion tends to be everywhere, and we have to respect the Legion. Of course, the Legionnaires have their particular prayer for those who have gone on, and we shall remember them, which is very important. And government, be it provincial, local, the mayor of the community came along last year, and sometimes the federal government's going to become very important. There's also the potential for the ecumenical movements. This year on July 1st in France, we know that the Bishop of Eastern Newfoundland and Labrador is going to be along with the Archbishop of St. John's in a wonderful ecumenical movement. But of course, when those soldiers went off to war, they didn't necessarily worry about being Protestant or Catholic. They were there for Newfoundland, so it's important to remember that. Also, remember to proselytize. We have people. We have them for our church service. We do proclaim who the true king of this world is. So I think that's important that this is part of the efforts of the church to bring people in and to proclaim the Prince of Peace as being in charge. Some don'ts. Do not glorify war. As we've seen from the first presentation, there's very little glory in war, except that the war is ultimately finished. The current Archbishop of Canterbury tells us in sermons to avoid the emotional claptrap, to not necessarily make it into an emotional exercise. You are going to be dealing with emotions besides, so why overemphasize these particular things? So avoid the histrionics or the outright emotional displays. That might not necessarily be the best way to go things. And by the way, if you're going to have a sermon, check your facts, particularly historical references. The first presentation was absolutely marvelous in going through some of the history of the situations. I've sat through various presentations where they've put the Battle of Beaumont Hamel into the Second World War, made it part of the Battle of the Bulge as opposed to the Battle of the Somme. So very quickly watch part of your presentations if you're going to make historical references. Also, avoid condemning parties, the enemies, commanding generals, or politicians. I think the first presentation showed that, yes, there were a lot of mistakes which were connected or committed. But I think it's important to say the conditions under which these people operated, that's particularly a good way of doing things. But to say that the commanders botched it and did very bad things, that's good for a seminar, which we had, but the underlying the conditions which they did. And I found out last week, I didn't know this until we had a presentation in the Episcopal Library of the Archdiocese on one of the chaplains from World War I. But that after the World War I, we had a monument set up in St. John's, and it was by Earl Haig, Douglas Haig, who had commanded the forces during World War I, and yet he was vilified for all the carnage which was created. The Battle of the Somme and the battles of Passchendaele and Ypres were very problematic, but when they chose a person to come, they chose the commander. So the mistakes which are in the past are there, but let's move on and remember who we're supposed to remember. And sometimes when we're doing these things, we have to watch our own emotions. I've seen people preach on Remembrance Day celebrations and break down, and so it's very problematic. So people are going to be speaking and that sort of thing. And by the way, for good liturgy, it has to be dignified and it has to be rehearsed. There's nothing good about throwing something together at the last moment and not having it flow, particularly when you're going to have non-church people involved, and just having them being at the right time, the right place, and knowing the specific role, which are fairly good. Inappropriate hymns, or maybe I should put it in the positive, use appropriate hymns. The Americans are forever doing the battle hymn of the Republic, and it just bounces off the particular ears, and it may be appropriate in their setting, but it might not be so appropriate in our setting. And even something, one of my favorite hymns, Onward Christian Soldiers, is more to deal with the church militant. It's not necessarily a militaristic hymn on that particular part. It also doesn't get into the looking at the individual. Avoid Pelagianism because we really need God in this particular part. So to say that all the salvation can come through human efforts might not necessarily be the best thing to do. And the one forgetting is that these are acts of worship and are fairly important and should have the dignified parts there. Now, use some of the existing prayers adopted for the day. And I was going to read through these, but I'll leave them with you as we're getting a bit short on time. But the BAS, a prayer for peace, is very important. Soldiers pray for peace. They don't necessarily want to be in the mud and in the trenches and being bombarded and becoming shell-shocked, but to care for those in authority. The Queen can be very relevant, but also the nation, the armed forces, and one of the newer ones, which is in the BAS, but not in the BCP, to pray for our enemies. During one Remembrance Day celebration, at one point, Memorial University of Newfoundland had Dr. Axel Meissen as the president, and of course he was of German background and actually German born, and some of the people took a great offense that he was at the Remembrance Day celebration, but it was entirely consistent with praying for our enemies, despite the fact that he was now a Canadian and obviously leading the university. But as we saw in the first presentation, the psychological impact on the German gunners was phenomenal. So people don't necessarily appreciate that these people are not the killing machines that we think they are. And if you read a wonderful book written just after World War I, Im Westen nichts Neues, which means in the West nothing new, or we translated All's Quiet on the Western Front, which show the futility of war. So these things are on both sides. Also, the German-American theologian Paul Tillich, of course, was a chaplain in the German army during World War I, and of course he spoke on the futility of war. So remembering the enemies, much along the lines of what Robert Runcie was talking about, was fairly important. And of course we still need the general intercession because this is not devoid of a particular time or place. It's everything which has been accomplished in the church. Conclude with a blessing or grace, depending on what type of audience which you have, can be very important. The BCP, I think does much the same sort of thing. Prayer for the Queen, those who are in authority, for peace in the world. The prayer is a little bit different. It's for those who serve in the Queen's forces, general intercession. They also have a good one about the deliverance in peril. And once again, conclude with the blessing or the grace. So scriptural readings, we can go through several of these, but they have a lot which is given in terms of which relate to the war or overcoming triumph. And many of these are in the Isaiah, which of course David Bell would pronounce Isaiah, but I figure there's just too many H's in there, or A's in there not to pronounce an A sound. Deuteronomy, or the Psalms. The Psalms, of course, one must remember them, that they are very regal in nature, but they also tend to be fairly militaristic.
Indeed.
They talk about Lord God of hosts, and sometimes the hosts can be translated as armies, so Lord God of armies, which is important. And once again, from the American viewpoint, if you read some of their stuff on the Psalms, they refer to God as the commander-in-chief, which is very much, once again, of a militaristic sort of thing. But just to read through a couple of these to give you a flavor, if you read in Isaiah about the time, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left, which tends to be fairly good for Beaumont Hamel, when only 68 people were able to answer the roll call the next day. And that comes from Isaiah 37:5. Or in Isaiah 37:14 to 20, to talk about how the Lord defeated Sennacherib. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, who is enthroned above the cherubim, you alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Of a truth, O Lord, the king of Assyria has laid waste to all the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were not gods, but the work of human hands, wood and stone. Therefore they were destroyed. So now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kings of the earth may know that you alone are God. So there is a triumphant nature to a great many of these. And if you read through them, there's some very good material which you might want to use. Some are better as sentences, some of them are better as expressions of hope. Should you have a gospel on this particular day? And if so, well, what gospel should you be? Whereas he's referred to as the King of Peace, but he also says, I come to bring not peace, but the sword. So you can get into very interesting sorts of discussions which are there. Now, Beaumont Hamel, they suggested liturgy. An introduction, of course, to set the particular day in motion to define it. Does the officiating minister do that, or is there going to be an MC? Is it going to be one person, or is it going to be a group of people? Are you going to have an ecumenical type of effort? In Pooch Cove, they circulated between the three major denominations there. Last year was the Anglicans' term, but I'm sure the United Church was going to barge on in. I think it's theirs this year, and then the Roman Catholics of the year afterwards. And we did a two-part to it. I was the protagonist, but we started off in the church, which was packed to the rafters, by the way, and then we walked down to the cenotaph. And it was very glorious at the beginning. They trooped in the colors, which were down. The volunteer fire department was there, but they also had Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, Sparks, Cubs, Beavers running around. And then we went off for the laying of a wreath. I did preach that particular day, and I did extemporaneously when I heard the readings, but I also was impressed by the colors. And I spoke about the flag and how the flag was so important, and that this was the 50th anniversary year of the adoption of the Canadian flag with the maple leaf, to point out that many of these people would not have gone to war using this, But here's other flags which become important as a symbol. And what do you fight for? Do you fight for a king and country? Do you fight for a flag? Do you fight for your mother, as we saw that the mom became very important? Do you fight for family, or do you fight for God? And all these particular things. Do you fight a quick war and then going to be home by Christmas? Perhaps one of the greatest lies of our time. Wars are never as short as we think they're going to be along the way. So what did we do? We had the procession of flags, guests in uniforms, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, other armed forces, the RNC, the CLB, volunteer fire departments, service groups, fraternal organizations. They all have their place on that particular day, and they're all people of God, which become very important. O Canada is the beginning. Some liturgies from the mainland say have O Canada at the end, but they're doing Remembrance Day liturgies. To start off with an opening prayer, there's going to be a gathering of the community, one which is then going to be all-encompassing. First reading, responsorial psalm, I think is fairly standard for a liturgy. It mimics not only morning prayer, but also a Eucharistic type of celebration. A gospel acclamation, if it's used. Reflections or homily. Now, are you going to give that, or is there going to be a leader from a particular group? And you have many different groups which are then brought together. Prayer for the armed forces, I think, is essential, very important. A prayer for the faithful departed. Not everybody comes back. And then, is there going to be a laying of wreath or some type of commemoration? Are you going to have this in the church at a cenotaph? So all these things become very important. And of course, if you're doing this Remembrance Day celebration, the poppies get used very frequently and are put onto a particular cross. I was given a forget-me-not this morning, which I'm wearing. And of course, the forget-me-not is the one which is associated with the Battle of Beaumont Hamel. And I thank the representative from the Archdiocese for having brought that in. Then, of course, the last post, silence or vow, becomes important. Closing prayer, once you've brought people in, let's, of course, we have to leave them out. A closing song, is there going to be one hymn at this particular part? Maybe the Ode to Newfoundland would follow that, or maybe the Ode to Newfoundland will be the closing one. And of course, for Beaumont, I think it's important to have the Ode to Newfoundland. Any type of closing remarks, and a blessing or the grace. Now, when we look at this, I found one from the Diocese of Saskatchewan and just adapted as an opening prayer. Loving God, you sent your Son to bring your peace to the world. Help us to work for peace in our home, our school, our city, and our world. Protect all soldiers who are at war and bring them home safely to their families. Grant peace and consolation to the families, members of soldiers who are grieving the loss of a loved one due to wars, remembering those in the Royal Newfoundland Regiment who paid the ultimate sacrifice. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Very simple, very direct, which I think becomes important. For the Liturgy of the Word readings, there were a few suggested earlier, should be proclaimed clearly, carefully from the Bible or the lectionary. Some suggested hymns, and once again, you notice I don't have the Battle Hymn of the Republic or Onward Christian Soldiers, but if people like Onward Christian Soldiers, to go for it. O God, our help in ages past, tends to be fairly important. Psalm 46, sung responsibly, can be very beautiful, or just sung straight through. All people that on earth do dwell, to remember that we are there. Jesus shall reign wherever the sun, and once again that goes back to the theme of prophetization, but also who is King of the world. He who would valiant thee, and Lord, for the years your love has kept and guided. So these are some suggestions, but ultimately they're probably going to be based on local circumstances. And one which I particularly like and can be very appropriate. I've heard it on St. Francis Day. I've heard it at funerals as a sung version. It's absolutely haunting. It goes to the soul without being over the top. But the Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And actually, when we did our Week of Living Liturgy at Queen's last fall, we had a visiting professor from Auburn University in the United States, Dr. Matthew Hulk, who did this as a song in our chapel, and by the time he was finished, there was not necessarily a dry eye, which is there. So, fine line between emotional claptrap and being evocative of emotions, but it's a very standard sort of one. And some additional Old Testament readings which might be done from either Isaiah, Jeremiah, the major prophets, and either Micah or Habakkuk, some of the minor type of prophets there. Now, Dr. Bell, of course, is a deacon, and he generally has to do a lot of the things with the priest walking around. Did you have any additional comments? Or?
Hardly any. I think you really covered everything. I think the thing that has to be avoided at all costs is mawkish sentimentality. The great thing, the thing about something like Beaumont Hamel is that the facts speak for themselves. They don't need a... The great thing about the presentation this morning was it was just clean-cut presentation of facts. And man, those facts don't need any elaboration. They don't need any technical of any sort being added to them. They're just there as they are. They are enough in themselves. And we hear too much of the playing, especially down south, too much playing on people's emotions, too much playing on people's susceptibilities, and that is something I think which is really, really, really to be avoided under all circumstances. I also like the fact that when I was at Leeds University, my first university when I was in 1920, and I stayed in a hall of residence. It was called Devonshire Hall. It was all men at that time, and there was a plaque outside the dining hall. We dined in gowns and all the rest is very formal, but there was a plaque outside the dining hall with the names of those students, boys of course, men, who had attended Devonshire Hall, that hall of residence, and who had died in the Second World War. And they were all there in alphabetical order, and you went down, there would be, say, Brown, and then there would be, say, Charles, and then there would be von Stefan, and then there would be, and so on. In other words, there were both the English names and the German names, English students and German students who had been there, and they were just commemorated each one because that is what they were. They were old students at Devonshire Hall, and no distinction was made between German students and English students at that time. And that, I think, in war is as it should be. We remember both sides. Both sides are doing what they thought was essential, necessary in the country. And we just state it as a fact, and we keep it as unsentimental as possible. And other than that, I have total agreement with my provost, and as a deacon, I shall, of course, always give him my total support, even when he may be wrong, which is, of course, hardly ever.
Except on pronunciation of
except on pronunciation of Isaiah.
And he did mention provost in the military would shoot down anyone who would turn the other direction. So, wonderful stuff this morning, folks. Thank you, Tony, for the history.
Yeah.
Not editing and editorializing and sensationalizing. Very well selected highlights and beautifully presented, yes. Genuine in it. Thanks, Alex, for great guidance, and yes. A great resource it will be for those who are participating in community events, church events, and so on, to remember the events of World War I, particularly of Beaumont Hamel, and for your own comments as well, David. They're wise, good comments to us, to help us to remember and to do as the title is, to gracefully remember.
Yes.
Tomorrow we have another two parts. In the morning at 9:30 we'll have the section called Appreciating the Military, where we have some panelists discussing both historical and current context of appreciating the military, current servicemen, veterans, families as well. So we have Dean Baxter Park, Reverend Chaplain Sean Sampson. We have Anne Walsh from the Archdiocese, who's aware, informed, and having done substantial research as well on some of the World War I activities around Newfoundland and off Newfoundlanders, and Dr. Gail Weidman from the Faculty of Social Work, who's a researcher on support for soldiers, veterans, and families. And in the second part, our colleague, Dr. Michelle Rebaudot, will do some overview and presentation on the concept of just war. We're looking forward to it, and we will upload the presentations and have them available through the queensnl.ca website. Thank you all, and
Thank you, Rick.
have a good day.
Thank you, Rick.
Bye-bye.
Excellent. Before you go, tell you something I found when researching. Around 1915, when the war had started, sons of particular individuals, or fathers of soldiers in the regiment, were writing to Governor Davis, and basically responsible for the regiment. Give us on commission, give us on commission. That's the way we were back then, you know, give us on commission. And so he started doing that. But after a while, like religious lines back at that time were bang, bang,